Hello and welcome again to Pod of the Gaps, the podcast which does indeed try to cover the gaps between church, culture, apologetics, mission, and everything in between. We are the in-between, well, not the in-betweeners, but we cover the gaps. We are the pod that covers the gaps, we think, or we hope. And we're glad to hear that many people have been listening and enjoying the podcast. And I'm here, my name, by the way, is Aaron Edwards, in case you are a first-time listener. And I am joined as ever by the partners in crime, Andy Bannister and Michael Otts. How are you gents doing?
Doing well. Doing very, very well. It's a very exciting day in the Bannister household because both my wife and I had our COVID jabs today. There's been a little bit of a mess up with the computer systems in NHS Scotland, but finally we got the jabs today, and I was worried about side effects and all this stuff you've heard. And the great news is I can report I've had no side effects other than I've got this overwhelming inclination to buy Microsoft products, and the cell phone reception has improved drastically in my house, but I'm sure that's not connected.
That's got to have nothing to do with it, I'm sure.
Nothing to do with it.
And how about you, Michael? Have you had your jabs yet?
Yeah, so Rebecca and I went for our jabs last week, actually. It was like the first thing we did after moving to Leicester. Not because you can only have them in Leicester, but because of the potential kind of side effects of not feeling great, we decided we wouldn't do it just before we moved house, given that we were going to have to lift about 1,000 boxes over the next 24 hours. But actually, in the end, it was all very fine. We went in, slightly sore arm, out the next day. And as I say, other than the phone reception and the Microsoft Office that I bought last week.
That's my joke, man. Just let us hands off that.
Just agreeing with you.
Yeah. He's retweeting you. He's retweeting you.
Aaron, though, hasn't had his jab. And I heard this rumor. It's only a rumor, Michael. It's only a rumor that they the more dispensable people they're pushing down the line. Sort of theologians and lawyers and those kind of
lifeboat theory. I mean, how they couldn't realise that my journal articles on obscure theological thinkers are not indispensable to the new civilization on Mars.
Absolutely.
I don't know what they...
So anyway,
no, I think what it is he's holding out for bribes because as we were chatting earlier before the show, we were discussing that in New York they were giving people hamburger and fries for getting their vaccine jabs. So as the situation potentially gets more needy in terms of we really want to get the last few people vaccinated, maybe they'll start giving out.
Go up, right?
Well, you say that the funny thing is, right? I actually was offered the vaccine a few months ago, way before people around my age were, because I've got asthma. I think I was on the system, and so I think I tried to book a couple of times, and the times didn't suit. I was really busy at the time. I thought, everyone's talking about side effects. I'll just leave it for now, and I still haven't managed to get it done. So I might be judged. We might lose listeners.
You could be judged on that basis.
I noticed. I noticed the NHS vaccine.
Part of the jabs, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, part of the interruptions. The NHS vaccine text that I get every now and then when they're trying to encourage me to go for and I haven't got a smartphone, as you know, so I can't click on the link there. So I tend to get the text at a random time and have to go and type in the URL later. But anyway, I've noticed the rhetoric in these texts has changed. It's sort of like at first it was it's possible for you to go if you come at this certain time only. And they've just gradually made it a bit better. We haven't quite got onto hamburger and fries, but my last text from them was, "You have reached the top of the queue and are a priority for getting a free NHS COVID-19 vaccine." I love the fact that firstly they say that it's free. Does anyone pay for it? Has people paid for it? I don't know. But equally that I've now reached the top. I was already at the top of the queue months ago, but they're now clearly been like, no one is taking us up on this offer. We've got to make them feel special.
And I've also heard as well, that for those who haven't got smartphones, they're going to they're moving into those with dumb phones like yours, and then it will be telegrams, homing pigeons at the door, and the town crier going through the street ringing his bell.
We say that honestly, it's so funny. I was telling a friend this the other day. I had to have a 20-minute conversation with someone from Amazon the other day because I tried to put my password in. They just did their verification thing where they used to send you a code. Now they send you a link, and I was like, right, so because you sent me a link, I literally can't open that on my phone. So I called them up, and to literally get through to them that I couldn't open a link on my phone. They're like, "What do you mean you can't open a link?" "I don't have a phone that can do that." Like, "What do you mean you don't have a phone that can do that?" "Let me speak to my superior." And I was like, I'm just going to tell them exactly the same. So it took 20 minutes for them to actually realise that there are people like us still here in the world. Anyway, speaking of people on the outside, on the margins, we have decided to take it upon ourselves to really push the boat out with our willingness to get cancelled. And our topic for today is what's wrong with gay conversion therapy. So, we've sort of teetered around the edges of cans of worms, but I think this is our moment to really dive in and get into something, given especially as it is Pride Month, which I know that, you're all very keen to celebrate in various ways for the whole month, I hope. And so we thought we'd sort of encounter this sort of issue of the intersections within sexuality that are being explored and expressed at the moment, starting with this very political hot potato, gay conversion therapy. So for those who may not know or may haven't been following this so much in the news, Michael, what on earth are we talking about with gay conversion therapy? Why is this a thing? What is it?
Well, I guess that is the question, really, and that's why it's a problem. On the one hand, when people talk about gay conversion therapy, they might be thinking of some fairly abusive and horrific practices, electrocuting people to get their sexual desires to change and so on, and stuff that pretty much most reasonable thinking people would say that's awful, that's manipulative, that's coercive. We don't like that. But at the same time, it could also potentially, by the way that certain bills are being worded, includes a minister who prays for someone who has expressed concern about their sexual desires and feels that they would like those sexual desires to change, and had asked the minister to pray for them in line with that. Potentially that could also be seen as gay conversion therapy, and therefore someone praying for someone in that context could be therefore deemed illegal. And so I guess that is the problem. What do we mean by this terminology? What comes into that remit? And once you start saying that we make this illegal, well, yes, some practices most of us would be against, but then there's a lot that you could sneak in by the back door potentially once you start going down that line.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's interesting, isn't it? That's kind of what people often fear when this has been going through the debates in Parliament, obviously. We know that people want to talk about religious freedom, but we're worried about the back door. What other things could be enabled or are currently enabled by the fact that it isn't banned. And so I guess that's sort of why they're going there, isn't it? And anything to add on that, of the significance of this issue or the terminology stuff?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things we're going to want to say, but I think the terminology interests me because I think we also live in an age where we love to demonize people by terminology, right? So if you are a woman who believes that gender, that biology is innate and that you can't simply become a woman just by going, "Hey, I'm a woman," then you're not a feminist. You're a TERF. You're a trans exclusionary reactionary feminist, and you're on other horrible titles. If you are somebody who is on the right wing of politics, and those particularly on the left wing of politics will love to label you in all kinds of ways. You're an oppressor of the poor. You're somebody who doesn't got no compassion. It's all about the money. And of course, those on the right have similar insults for those on the left. And when it comes to this, if you don't swallow the idea that sexuality is utterly innate, that nothing can be changed, that somebody might not want actually to explore whether their sexuality can be, I don't want to use the word adjusted. That's the wrong word. I'm looking for the wrong. I'm struggling for an adjective there. But if you don't believe, that whole package of ideas, then you are labelled. And so the way that, as you say, gay conversion therapy, on the one hand, conversion therapy can be attached to things that are absolutely horrific, and I think any right-thinking person would want to raise some red flags. But then the same label is stuck on, as Michael said, somebody who simply says to their pastor, "Hey, I'm wrestling with same-sex attraction. I don't want to act on that. I want to live a biblically faithful life. Would you pray with me? So you can perhaps I can work that through." That's labeled with the same thing. And I suppose as a philosopher, and philosophy is all about words. When a term like conversion therapy covers such a range of things, I think it's become useless. I think we need precision, and I think it's an unhelpful term, and it's loaded and quite deliberately loaded.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think even as you say, it's not only that it's broad, the term, but it's also got a particular connotation, doesn't it? Therapy suggests something very intentional. It suggests that it's sort of supposedly backed up scientifically in some way. It supposes a kind of course of treatment, medication, even. It puts these ideas in your mind, even perhaps of psychotherapy or psychoanalysis, as Michael has mentioned as well, kind of shock therapy. So immediately, if you are thinking of the word therapy and everything that connotes, and you suddenly allow any religious person who wants to encourage somebody out of that because of their own belief and mutually speaking as well, that becomes therapy too. Which again, it's just not fair, is it, to kind of put those things on them if you want to try and distinguish these appropriately? But it's also politically amiable for them to put it under one big banner, I would say, because obviously I think part of this is that those pushing for the ban, they don't want people around who actually believe that it's not okay to be gay, not okay to practice homosexuality because of their religious beliefs. They think those views are abhorrent. The people who believe them are homophobic, this kind of thing. So it's clearly politically motivated. I would suggest that that they want to kind of lump it all together and smear even the possibility of somebody who wants to pray with someone, because they'll say, oh, maybe you're okay, maybe you're fine. They don't really think that. They think you're a bigot. But maybe you're okay, you've got good intentions, and we want to respect your freedom religiously. But we're worried more about these other things that could come through the door, which I think is part of the problem here, isn't it, that we face. Yeah. And so, I mean, have you guys sort of, come across any debates on this, or kind of figures you've sort of seen speaking about this that have sort of pushed this any further?
Well, yeah, I think there's the two places where I've seen the debate beginning to happen. Obviously, the issue is beginning to be talked about in Parliament. Certainly, down in Westminster, there's been some talk about it. But then, interesting, the Scottish, I don't like to use the word Scottish Parliament because it gives the thing a sort of credibility I don't think it has. But the Scottish Executive is correct term. We did a show on nationalism the other time, didn't we? So my colours are firmly nailed to the mast. I mean, there's been talk here in Scotland about Scotland wanting to lead the world in getting this kind of stuff banned because, the SNP, who, have Scotland's political life in an iron grip, want to try and portray themselves as cuddly and progressive and so forth. And I think it's another example of that. So I think it's happening in the political kind of sphere. And then, of course, happening in the church sphere, most notably, actually, of course, in the Anglican Church, where there's been, the Anglican Church is in sort of convulsions, some might say death throes, but let's be generous and say convulsions over the whole issue of human sexuality, and this is part of that. So there are people like Steve Chalk and Jane, whose surname I forget, but you reminded me. Thank you, Jane Ozanne, and others who've sort of, I think, almost using this as a slight Trojan horse, actually, to say, well, let's use this as an issue to actually open up the whole issue of human sexuality and gay marriage. And, there's a lot in that. There's lots of folks in that debate who I think see this as a wedge issue to get the Anglican Church to change its views on marriage in general. So I've seen, there's a political discussion, there's a church denominational discussion, and those circles obviously overlap slightly.
Yeah, that's interesting. Go on, Mike.
And it is interesting, isn't it? Because you've got a lot of people expressing real concern about this in terms of what that means for religious freedom. Does the state have the right to be able to, effectively outlaw praying for someone, particularly when that person has asked for prayer in the first place? But then on the other hand, as we said, it was just a couple of days ago, the Bishop of Manchester, I think, came out and said basically, he would back the prosecution of anyone who was, quote, harming people in that way. And I guess, again, the difficulty with the word harm is it's a very kind of vague term, isn't it? Like on the one hand, of course, no one wants to harm anyone, but what do we construe as harmful? Well, if you're going to say that praying for someone was seen as being harmful, then it's dangerous, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. That's a good point. And that feeds into the problem of being able to speak for people who do disagree, who are labelled as harmful or oppressive, feeling less free to even speak about it. So it's one thing being willing to pray for someone who's gay, but it's also another thing to even speak about your view that you would do this if someone asked for prayer. And I was interested reading a bit of the book we've mentioned several times, The Madness of Crowds, the Douglas Murray book. We've mentioned before Douglas being, of course, himself gay, but a critic of the LGBT sort of lobbying group. He thinks basically that they've won their battles that they needed to win to overcome homophobia, which I think many Christians would agree would be a problem. Homophobia would be. And now they've pushed it too far, and this is what he's kind of critiquing. And I've read an interesting, he went to a screening of a kind of gay conversion therapy kind of documentary. He speaks about this in the chapter, which is called Gay in his book, Madness of Crowds. And he notices several of the interviewees who were gay once but now appear here with their faces blacked out. So they are people who were gay who have now kind of converted, as it were, to heterosexual perhaps orientation, perhaps practice. I'm not quite sure what it specifies, but they were gay and now they're not. And he says perhaps it's too charitable to reflect that it wasn't so long ago that this need for blackened out faces and back of head shots would have applied the other way around. I thought that's a really, really insightful point, that we've gone from a place where there was a time in British society and Western society more broadly, where if you were gay, it would be difficult to come out. It's almost the case now where you have to come out of the closet as a quote-unquote bigot because you're seen as this by somebody who thinks that you need to get in line with, you need to catch up with where contemporary society is on this issue. And it's moved so fast, it's probably easier for people maybe tend to reason to stay quiet rather than to speak up.
Yeah. There are so many issues there, aren't there? I mean, it was interesting on the speaking up piece. We were chatting before we hit the record button, weren't we? You look at, say, someone like, say, Philip Schofield, famous kind of well-known, sort of TV celebrity, in fact, children's TV presenter when I was a kid, and so as I've grown up, he's grown up and now does sort of daytime TV and stuff. And happily married for years with kids and all. And was it last year or so, fairly recently? Came out as gay. So basically, walked away from his family and his children. Caused potential seismic shockwaves there, I guess. And it's now, with a male partner, as I understand. And of course, he's celebrated. Everyone comes out, pardon the pun, and goes, "Yay, Philip! Isn't it wonderful? He discovered his true identity." And he's lauded in the newspapers and or certain newspapers. But I remember I was reflecting, saying that would be interesting. How would that have been if that was the way around? That if Philip for 20 or 30 years had been, self-identifying as gay, had been with a same-sex partner, they adopted children together, and after 20 years comes out and goes, actually, I'm heterosexual, and I'm walking away from that relationship and those kids, and I'm marrying a woman, and I'm going to live a life as heterosexual. I wonder whether the likes of The Guardian and such forth, would have had similarly running headlines go, he's so brave. He's embraced his true identity. So it is interesting that it only runs one way. I have a couple of quick things I wanted to say, but then, Michael already got stuff to add too. You mentioned the religious freedom angle. I think it's important we also talk about this. Is not just about religious freedom, is it? It's about personal freedom. Because I've got a friend of mine here in Dundee who's a counsellor. I remember him saying to me that he had some concerns because he'll occasionally, because of the nature of the kind of field that he works in, have clients come to him who are struggling with same-sex attraction and want to change that struggle and live differently. And he said, all of my counselling training is that you listen to the clients and you then kind of help them achieve the personal goals that they have set for themselves. So if this sort of, becomes, illegal or whatever, what do I do? I'm then stuck between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, I could turn, if I turn around to the client and say, no, go away, I can't do that. Potentially, I could be reported actually as a counsellor because I'm imposing my view of who they should be on themselves, and that breaks all kinds of professional stuff. On the other hand, if I turn around and go, absolutely, I'll help you work to achieve that end, then I can be reported to the police. So what do I do as a counsellor? And then harm, I just want to say something very quickly on harm is interesting, isn't it? Because I had a fascinating conversation with a couple of years ago with a friend of mine who's a pastor here in Scotland. I won't mention which city because it might identify, which church, but he very evangelistic church, and there was a young man who started coming to their congregation and exploring faith, but really, really, really struggling. Came close to following Christ, but couldn't quite kind of commit. And then one day he kind of booked an appointment with my friend who's the pastor and came and so basically poured out everything that was going on. And what was going on was that he was in a gay relationship. And he'd had lots of very helpful, kind of very progressive Christian friends who'd gone, no problem, you don't need to change any of this, that's all fine. And actually, at the same time, the Holy Spirit was convicting him. And basically, he'd come to see my friend because he'd said to my friend who's the pastor, the sermon you preached the other Sunday night, which was nothing to do with sexuality at all, funnily enough, in the middle of that, he'd had this very powerful experience of the Holy Spirit convicting him and saying, you need to walk away from that relationship and find your identity in Christ. That's what I'm asking you to do. And as the pastor prayed through with him on that and he followed through on that, he then gave his life to Christ and suddenly everything took off. But my friend would say the harm was being caused in that, the spiritual harm, by well-meaning Christian friends that were holding that gentleman back, because they were saying, no, 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 you don't need to change. And actually the Holy Spirit, actually in this case, was saying, yes, 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 you do need to change. And what he needed was someone to hold his hand and help him just take that step. So I think the harm thing is interesting. I think gross spiritual harm is done when we simply affirm people's position and go, your life is absolutely fine. Nothing needs changing. There's no worries at all. We just carry on. Christianity is a self-help program. Live life you want, have sex with who you want, make the choices you want, and just put the Jesus sticker on top, and life will be wonderful.
Yeah.
I think that has leaks all over the place.
Absolutely. Michael?
I think just thinking about it kind of pastorally, how do we operate as Christians on this? I think there is a challenge, isn't there? Because we want to say that, it's clear the Bible's teaching on human sexuality. We think that's, we want to affirm that. What does it therefore practically mean for someone who experiences same-sex attraction who becomes a Christian? And the reality of people's experiences would be that it's a variety of things. For some, it's those desires don't change and they choose to live a celibate life, and there are examples of that we could think of. But there are also examples of those who come to know Jesus and they find over time, either in one experience or maybe progressively, that those desires change and they end up in a heterosexual marriage relationship sometime in the future. And both of those things can happen. I think what's interesting, though, is that we can be incredibly nervous, can't we, as Christians, to talk about the second category because of the culture's reaction against gay conversion therapy, or what people think by that. So even to kind of potentially suggest that is a possibility is something that maybe we can steer clear from. Now, I think we've got to be careful because, it's not guaranteed. If I come to know Jesus, that, this area of my life will change. We just don't know, do we? As with every other area of our lives, when we come to know Jesus, we don't know what it will exactly mean for us. But I think sometimes we can just be too hesitant to say this could even be a possibility. And from a secular point of view, most people are quite happy to accept that there is fluidity to sexual orientation. Although, as Andy mentioned earlier, we're happy to talk about it going one way than the other way. But experience would say that there is, just on a completely secular level. So
that's really interesting. And there's a couple of things you could say on the back of that. Firstly, there's a sense in which whatever the latest or the second realization of your sexuality, as it were, maybe, or your fruition, it would always be the trajectory towards homosexuality would be then fixed, and it wouldn't be able to move beyond that. If anything, you'd think it'd be more consistent to say that sexual conversion therapy is the problem. So even someone who, like Philip Schofield, therefore, would seem, you'd almost have to say, well, Philip Schofield, you're married, you're heterosexual, it seems, but now you're becoming gay. That's not right. You're not allowed to do that because you're not allowed to change your sexuality or something. But apparently, when you move the other way, you can't change your sexuality. Again, as you say, there's fluidity in these things, seemingly. But we seem to think that once you're in this camp, you can't come out of it because that would be offensive. And it's so politically motivated. The other thing with that is, I had a debate on Twitter with someone who was defending Steve Chalk in various ways. And I'll get back onto Steve Chalk in a moment about a debate. But it was interesting that he was really going to town on saying you cannot change things that are fundamental to human existence. And I was thinking, and so I replied, what about gender, which we talk about all the time? We talk about gender fluidity. And it suits us to talk about that. Is that not fundamental to human existence, whether you're male or female? No. That's fluid, and it's merely a construct that we think in terms of binaries of male, female, and therefore we're happy to kind of shift between them. Almost, there's not as much problem as to go, I was male, now I'm female, and now I'm fluid in perhaps a different way, or perhaps I'm crossing in between them. Though there's a lot more acceptance for that. But when it comes to sexuality, it seems the rules are completely fixed in a different direction and skewed, really, aren't they?
Well, there's a couple of other things that flow out of this as well. I mean, because of that, as you say, that the fluidity is only seen to move one way, Philip Schofield and so on and so forth. Of course, what I find fascinating is that those who do move the other way, and there are plenty of stories, the kind of fire and vitriol they get either from their former own side or from those that are more, for want of a better word, progressive end of things, and to go, it's vicious. And I think we may have mentioned on the podcast before, but if not, a great resource and a website I'd commend to listeners. If you ever look at livingout.org, because Living Out is a website run by a collection of Christian men and women who have that experience of being same-sex attracted, and either that has changed or they are choosing to not act on it and live biblically faithful lives, and to go, some of the stuff they've had to put up with, even from fellow Christians, because of that sort of sense of you're breaking the mold. And I think their stories need to be told more. So people like Ed Shaw and Sam Albury and others who I count as friends, and I think this is really, really interesting. But I tell you the other thing that's interesting, not merely as your point there about your friend on Twitter that you engaged with there, Aaron, but not only is there the idea that these things are innate, then there's the idea, of course, that we are slaves to our desires, that I find absolutely fascinating. And this is a very, again, boy, if we're going to get cancelled, controversial area to get into, because the temptation is that, we're not careful. We associate the word, gay with a series of other behaviours that are, considered beyond the pale. But we are all, find within ourselves a whole series of urges and desires and leanings and temptations and wants, all those adjectives. And to go, even before we get into what the Christian faith says about there, just normal sort of secular psychology would say you don't have to act on them. You can reflect on them and process them and deal with them and think about them. But certainly as a Christian, you'd want to say, well, hang on a minute, isn't the whole point of Christian faith that all of those are surrendered to the Lord? And some of them will be dealing with them will be 70 years of discipleship, and we may still be wrestling with those things, but we are not slaves to our passions. It's the difference between, I would say, being a human being and an animal. Is an animal is a slave to its passions. As a human being, we are not. And the Christian faith obviously says a lot more than that. That actually in Christ we are new creations, and the old is dead. And there's something about Christian discipleship that says we need to do some killing of these things. And I'm sorry to be that direct for some and name the elephant of going and around sexuality. There's a whole series of things that just require killing, whether that is, I think, same-sex attraction, whether it's pornography, whatever it is. And to go, we want to be compassionate and come alongside people, but also go, no, it is not, I think, the right response as a Christian to go, we're just going to affirm it. We don't condemn. And maybe, the Galatians, doesn't it, in the scriptures, talks about carrying one another's burdens. Yeah. I remember years ago when I was back in Toronto hearing Charles Price, very well-known, set up led the Cape and Ray Bible Schools for a long time, led People's Church in Toronto, big 6,000 person church. And he gave a wonderful sermon on human sexuality a few years ago when we lived in Toronto, and preached on that very text in Galatians. And he ended the sermon wonderfully. He said, my prayer for People's Church here in Toronto, he said, is that we would be a congregation which it is safe for people to come out. Not that we then affirm their sexuality, but then we then come alongside them and go, you're struggling with that. Let me walk with you. Let me help you. Let me support you. And yes, there'll be failures, and yes, there'll be mess ups, and we will not condemn you. We will walk with you on the path of discipleship. And I think right now, sadly in the church, there are at times only two options. There are absolutely churches where if you come out as same-sex attracted, you do just get condemnation. Let's name that. There is homophobia in the church, and it needs addressing. But the other option doesn't work either, where you come out and you're like, brilliant, absolutely, that's fantastic. Let's stick the rainbow flag on the pulpit. Yeah. And there has to be a third way between either just hugging and affirming, or just condemning. And I think that third way is the path of discipleship and Christ following, taking up our cross and walking after our Lord. And for some of us, that cross carrying is going to be in the area of sexuality. It's not going to be easy.
And I think just on that, David Bennett in his very helpful book, biography, A War of Loves, talks about that. So David Bennett, who was a gay activist in Australia, encountered Jesus in a pub very unexpectedly, and then wrestled with what that meant for his sexuality, and ultimately came to the conclusion that actually that meant that he was going to live as a celibate gay Christian. His sexual desires haven't changed, but isn't acting on them in that way. But that was a long process of wrestling for him to come to, that he describes in the book. But he describes those kind of different reactions from the kind of homophobia of the kind of Christian far right, you might say, but also to the harmful kind of attitudes of other Christians who are basically he found being unhelpful. And ultimately, he just felt, actually, as I read scripture and as I wrestled with this and I prayed about this, I felt this was the right way to go. And he says, actually, there were times when he's faced real negative reactions from people who claim the name of Christ, who feel that he's wrong. And he's like, actually, as Andy's saying, we need to get a balance here. There's two great pitfalls that we can fall into, and we want to watch out for both of them.
That's right. And it's interesting when we talk about, I mean, David Bennett is a really interesting case for that, isn't he? And obviously he was someone who I think became a Christian, and part of that was part of his conversion from unbelief, and as well as his sexuality, which was really interesting case there, because often the case is made the church needs to get more missional in order to reach LGBT groups by affirming. But anyway, that's a slightly separate issue, which we'll probably pick up when we talk about this relating to marriage, maybe in a few weeks' time or so. But just to link off of the back of what Andy was saying as well there about sin, how seriously we take sin as Christians, and whether if we believe homosexual practice is not going to be good for someone because it's sinful, how committed are we to carrying one another's burdens, as it were, to caring about them as disciples, rather than it being like an option? Oh, this is just my belief, almost like an end times belief that doesn't particularly make a huge difference to our life now. Do you believe in, are you a premillennialist, or you're an amillennialist, or a postmillennialist? The kind of thing which we can just put off into the distance. It won't really affect our day-to-day life. I mean, it probably does actually, but anyway, and that's a theological debate we can get into another time. But it's interesting that this issue has become like that, like a secondary issue, to the extent that it doesn't matter. But if you believe homosexuality is sinful, and you may even believe homosexual orientation is sinful, and that God doesn't like it, it's not okay for you to not care about your brothers and sisters enough to speak about that. And this is where it gets difficult, because, of course, as we've been saying, as Douglas Murray and others have been saying, it's not easy to speak about this if you don't affirm. And I had an interesting experience. We mentioned Steve Chalk. I got asked by the Religion Media Centre last autumn to come and speak in a kind of Zoom panel with journalists there to kind of take notes on what these religious people are talking about on this very issue of gay conversion therapy. And Steve Chalk was in this debate, and Jane Ozanne was in this debate. So all the kind of big hitters. And then I was wondering and I said, when is this debate then? They said, we want you to come and give the evangelical view. So when is this? Oh, it's tomorrow at 12 o'clock. And I was like, seems rather late for you to be assembling your panel. Might I suggest, is it possible that I'm not the first person you've asked to speak on this issue? And they're like, well, you're right. It has been difficult for us to get a voice on the evangelical side to speak on this. I was like, yeah, I'm not surprised. And why do you think that is? And we had an interesting discussion. I said, here's what I'd probably talk about. And said, yeah, that's fine. Come on the call. So I don't know who was listening journalist-wise, but it was being live tweeted, which I found interesting. And it was the first time I'd engaged with Jane Ozanne directly. And it was interesting because not only was it odd the fact they couldn't find the evangelical to speak, but as soon as I started speaking and the things that I started saying, all of the traffic came towards me. All of the stuff in the chat, I was trying to respond to various things in the chat as I was speaking, but constantly the kind of looks I was getting, the head shakings or violent head shakings on this call. And it was really interesting. My main point was actually to defend those Christians who would take sin that seriously. So obviously the very idea that we see certain things as sinful, to a Jane Ozanne or a Steve Chalk, is a horrible thing, is almost sinful ourselves. I think they'd probably almost say that it's sinful for you to think that it's sinful. I said, well, what about West African Pentecostals, who the majority of which, especially those here in the UK, who may set up black majority churches, not because they want to always, just because that's sometimes how it goes culturally, and they have often been on the worst end of this sort of abuse. And that's at this time, this very time of Black Lives Matter, and make sure we're not being colonial in any way, of assuming we're right and others here are wrong. When it comes to this issue, we're totally happy to tell vast swathes of black West Africans, you need to be educated. You need to get educated, and then you'll understand. We know we've learned something in the West that you haven't learned. And when you do learn it, you can stop being so primitive. That's basically, I've seen that attitude in academic conferences. I've seen it in conversations over lunch tables when I've got African students, and I've seen there a very progressive, white, liberal, kind of condescending in the way they're looking at them, patronizing them. And I just think this is almost hilarious if it wasn't so outrageous. To see this and to see someone pouring their heart out, talking about their view because they want to liberate people from sin, and this person is looking at them like they are a horrible person or really stupid, either of those. And I think this comes to a head in that there was that case, I forget where the church was exactly, but there was an undercover journalist who went in and pretended to be a same-sex attracted Christian who wanted prayer into a Pentecostal church where they're going to be a bit more, shall we say, forthright in the way they pray. So they're not going to pray like a nice, genteel Anglican. They're going to pray in tongues. They're going to put their hands on you. And that's fine. That's normal. That's biblical. And to Pentecostals, it's quite normal. I know they don't get too much of that up in Scotland, Andy. By experience, they kind of run away from the Spirit. Yeah, but it's perfectly normal culturally to do that. And I've even seen on ITV, it was a kind of news channel. Well, no, it's just a channel. But like the ITV news segments where they've shown a 7-second clip of an African praying in tongues, sounding crazy and demented when they're talking about gay conversion therapy. And I was like, that is literally racist. And how on earth you can get away with doing that at a time when we're truncating racism over left, right, and centre in all sorts of other ways? I have no idea. So it's really interesting how these two things collide, and we're happy to be completely prejudicial against black people and against particular swathes of the church when it suits us, whichever political agenda happens to be loudest.
I think you're dead. I think you're dead right, and I think, gosh, I mean, we got so many opportunities being cancelled in this episode. I think, and I say this very carefully, but in some quarters of the church, the fact that folks have attached themselves to this issue is, I'm afraid, just nothing more than a power grab, because they've seen which way they think the church is swinging, particularly these larger, older denominations like the Anglican Church and the Methodist Church. And I know you said the Methodists have got a conference coming up in a few weeks' time on this issue, and lo and behold, they've excluded all the overseas people because they think they might run it the wrong way. But it's a power game, and so for someone like. And we say someone like Steve Chalk, I'm going to name the elephant here to go, Steve was that it was centre of evangelicalism, and he had his little tribe around him. And I think things shifted and he lost that power and influence. And now he's figured out, well, if I play, the rainbow bedecked, sort of liberal Baptist minister, I will get power. And I do think, money, sex and power are the three big temptations in Christian leadership. And I think Steve has gone for the power piece, I'm afraid. It also reminds me as well that so often when we talk about sin, we need to remember that behind the kind of surface level sins that I think are the sort of symptoms of the underlying disease, there are some pretty primary ones that underlie everything else. I think idolatry is a big one in the scriptures, and I think obviously around the area of sex and hedonism and things that very often is where people end up sort of identifying their lives. Then I think power is another, and so I think it's interesting that behind this issue, does lie things like what you think sin is. Do you just think it's occasionally doing something a bit naughty, tweeting the wrong thing, but a quick slap on the wrist, you're okay? Or is it something more structural? And of course, this is probably an issue for another episode, on the whole biblical authority piece. And interestingly, with Steve, right? Steve is a textbook example of this, that he began to go a bit wibbly wobbly on sexuality because he met a nice, gay couple and changed his view. And as I think Tim Keller once pointed out, if you change your view on the biblical view of sexuality because you meet a nice gay couple, that means before you met the nice gay couple, you were a bigot. Whereas the rest of us, hold the views we do because we think this is what the Bible teaches, not because we hate people. So, maybe Steve has some issues there. But now Steve is also, I was about to say slodden. That's not the past tense of slid. It should be,
I think we should. Yeah, that works.
Slid. Steve is now slided into, the Bible is now in question. The identity of Jesus is in question. I don't say this with any form of sort of triumphalism, but I wouldn't be surprised if, given another 10 years down the road, Steve will be sort of, a complete full-blown universalist, maybe even a sort of, effectively a functional atheist. Because I think once the authority of Scripture goes, which is one of the issues behind this, the skids are greased for everything else.
And it's interesting, in the end of the debate, he basically completely sidelined my points and summed up the debate because he was trying to promote this sort of thing he does with sort of post-conversion sanctuaries, and using all the worst examples of the kind of shock therapy or let's say, at the hands of some of these Pentecostal preachers who preach kind of fervently and speaking about, sin in terms of demonic activity and that kind of thing, which is different. There's different ways of speaking about that. That could be problematic depending on what you thought. But if you were a Pentecostal who believed demonic activity is associated with your sin, which I think many Christians would believe appropriately, that can get really harsh treatment. So we talk about all the worst possible examples. I think Jane Ozanne also mentioned an example of someone being raped in order to try to convert them back to heterosexuality. It's really hard to know what to do with that, because I think you were saying earlier, there's no details on that, there's no context. Clearly that is not a normal practice. That's not what a Christian anywhere would think there's a good idea. So wherever that's come from, it's almost ludicrous. But these are very powerful emotive stories, really very horrible situations of abuse. And right at the end, obviously everyone gets lumped in with that. The kind of any Christian who prays with someone who wants to be freed from homosexual attraction. Steve Chalk at the end just sort of sums up and says, well, I'm just looking forward to the payday that's going to arrive when this law comes through, and when people can sue these churches who, and not even continuous cases, past cases. So how many examples will rack up of people who've ever been prayed for who could claim emotional damages and bankrupt just hundreds and hundreds of churches? He just said this with a glee on his face. I just thought, goodness me, I think we're beyond the pale here. Like, it's really difficult to see how this is a positive thing. But for him, he's convinced himself that all of these churches, like the majority of them presumably, are then abusive and abusing people. So if you get that in your head, then of course, I guess you go down this litigious route. But it's interesting how, how the kind of things, the quite savage things that can come out when you open those kind of things up, as you say, Andy, which tend to go on a scale.
I guess one of the questions I have off the back of all of this is, we can talk about this quite openly. We're three Christians, we're committed to the authority of Scripture, and so we're kind of coming from that start point. But one of the difficulties, and it was the same discussing, say, gay marriage, is that how do you then speak up in society without sounding like the bigots? Because it's like, everyone can have in their mind the worst thing that they imagine when it comes to gay conversion therapy that we would be against as well. So then when we question or say, I'm against this kind of new law that's coming in, people are like, so you're for it then? And so, see what I mean? Like, we look like the most bigoted, uncompassionate, uncaring people. We want to stand up for what we think is right. But how do we do that? Like, it's my question. How do we communicate this or ask questions about this in a way where people who don't share our set of assumptions would see more helpfully where we're coming from?
Yeah, that's really, really, really key. And this is the kind of thing that we've been wrestling with, isn't it? With how do we handle this, and how do we enable the church to be the church and look after one another, and to kind of proclaim what we believe to be true, and that includes, proclaiming against homophobia and sort of denouncing practices which are unhelpful. But I think the danger, as I've said, that the silence issue, which we've spoken about before, not speaking up, can be really harmful, because you end up thinking, well, we'll just not fight this battle. And then eventually, as long as the wolves don't come for us, and they will come for you. If you hold that view in any way, even if you don't express it publicly, they'll find a way to get you, I'm sure, because I can see the direction of travel. We can all see the direction of travel. We're not, we have to have our eyes open here and realize that it's not just a small little thing. So fighting the battle for speaking up against the ban is important. I think we should definitely have some kind of ban, of course, about these other practices. I presume they're already illegal. I think that's something that many of them might notice, that all of the terrible examples are already illegal. So because they're just ridiculous situations. So really, this is a way of trying to stop people praying because they just don't agree with your view. It's a kind of thought police thing as much as anything else.
And I think that's I mean, we're running out rapidly out of time, but I think that's a great, you said, what questions would you raise with somebody? I think that's where I would begin. I'd actually begin with those more sort of legal, societal things. If I was talking with someone who didn't, share my Christian faith on that, I think I'd begin by going, there are some absolutely gruesome abuses out there. What examples do you have of ones that the current law won't catch? And just actually get them to do the work on that. Then I think I might go to, the interesting thing is, we also live in this age where people do think sexuality is fluid. And I'm really worried this law could shut down people, being free to actually sort of think about who they're, play them a little bit, actually, because of going, then, because presumably this law could pick up, a Philip Schofield, for example. And then I would find the way to bridge into the gospel. And I think probably I would bridge into the gospel by going, I think one of the things the Christian faith tells us is that actually, ultimately, laws from without don't change the heart from within. All of us have views of how we'd like the world to be. And I think the problem is that the moment you start legislating for the left, right, and centre beyond the basics of please don't kill each other and stick weapons in each other, then it becomes a huge problem. And we're ducking around the real issue here, I think, which is how do we actually address the human heart? And I don't think you can do that through the legislative mechanisms. I don't think that works. Whether you label it thought policing or whatever you label it, I don't think it ever ends. It ever ends well. And I think for me that's so powerful about the message of Christ and the Christian faith is it does say it can do something about those heart issues. It can touch the place that that legal apparatus can't. That's roughly how I would try and figure out a way through it.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good kind of place to end it. Unless, Michael, do you have any final pearls?
No, I think that was really helpful. Thank you.
There you are. Well, we've come to the end of our time, and so if we do indeed survive to make another show, we hope that you will be listening next time. And we've certainly enjoyed chatting amongst ourselves here, and I hope you've enjoyed listening in. And do continue to liking, subscribing, and all of that normal podcast malarkey that we hear and propagate, and share it with people you think that it would be helpful for. Until next time, farewell. This has been Pod of the Gaps. I've been Aaron Edwards, and Andy Bannister and Michael Otts. See you next time.
Bye for now.
Bye.